I tasted the words before I spoke them. They were already on my tongue. Warm, metallic, wrong, like something pulled from a place inside me that wasn't meant to have a voice. I could feel them press against my teeth every time the room went quiet, every time a sentence ended and left that small, empty space where a different truth could have fit. But my mouth stayed shut. It wasn't courage that failed me. Courage is too clean a word. This was smaller. This was instinct. The kind that tightens your throat when you hear boots in a corridor. The kind that teaches you, without lessons, that certain sounds don't belong to you. I listened to myself breathing and tried to make it quieter. Around me there were other breaths, other bodies, the faint scrape of fabric when someone shifted their... Somewhere close, a hand brushed paper. Somewhere farther, something ticked, steady, indifferent, marking time as if time were neutral and not a weapon. I told myself I didn't know enough. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I would wait for a clearer moment, one that would arrive with permission and certainty, as if either of those things existed here. And in the pause between one ordinary remark and the next, I watched my own mind assemble excuses the way men assemble equipment, quickly, efficiently, without sentiment, a practiced routine, a reflex with the shape of obedience. If I spoke, it would change the air, it would draw eyes, it would turn attention toward me like a beam of light in a dark room. And light, I had learned, can be worse than darkness. In darkness, you can pretend you are not being measured. In light, you are suddenly a question that needs to be answered. My chest held the warning like an illness. I tried to swallow it down. It didn't go. I tried to set it aside, just for now, just until later, like an object that could be picked up again when it was safer to touch. But it wasn't an object. It was a sentence. And sentences don't sit patiently. They insist. They grow teeth. They start to ache. There were moments, brief and sharp, when I almost did it. A small opening, a shift in tone, a lull where someone's certainty softened into something like thought. My body leaned forward before my mind agreed. My lips parted. I could feel the start of sound forming, the beginning of the shape. Then I saw it in my own imagination, the turn of heads, the pause that would follow, the way silence can become a judgment before anyone says a word. I saw faces close around the space I'd create, not angry, worse than angry, flat, attentive, assessing. I saw the question written everywhere, who are you to interrupt? And behind that question, another. What do you think you are? The warning wasn't dramatic. That was the cruel part. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a prophecy. It was only a simple something you could say in a calm voice, the way you might point out a loose step in a stairway or a crack in a wall before it widened. A small correction, a quiet hesitation, a request to look again. But I knew what small things could do. I had seen how a single sideways glance could ruin a man for months. How one word, said at the wrong time, could follow you like a smell. How the room could remember you even when the conversation pretended not to. So I kept my face neutral. I made my hands still. I watched other mouths move, watched certainty pass between them like a shared cigarette, something traded easily, breathed in without thinking about the cost. And the more they spoke, the more my warning began to feel like an intrusion, like a stain I was supposed to hide. I hated myself for how quickly I adapted, because there was a part of me, quiet but stubborn, that kept insisting the words mattered. That the silence I was choosing wasn't harmless. That it wasn't the same as caution. That it wasn't the same as patience. It was a decision. Even if no one would call it that, I could feel my heartbeat answering every pause, like it was trying to speak in my place. I could feel heat rising behind my eyes. Not tears, nothing so honest. Just pressure. Just the body reacting to a truth it couldn't release. And still, I waited. I waited for someone else to say it. I waited for an accident to interrupt the flow. I waited for anything that would let me keep my hands clean without actually doing the work of being clean. The room stayed ordinary. That was how it trapped you. It offered you normal voices, normal gestures, normal time passing. It made you believe that if something truly terrible were near, you would feel it more clearly. But I did feel it, just not the way I expected. Not like thunder, like a low vibration beneath the floor. Like a distant engine you can't see yet, but you know it's coming closer. My throat tightened. The words pressed forward once more, ready, and I let them stay where they were, locked behind my teeth, because by then I had already chosen the safest sound a person can make in a... None at all. The first time I understood where I was, I didn't understand it through maps or flags or speeches. I understood it through rules that weren't written in. You learned them by watching what happened to people who didn't know them yet. In that place, nothing needed to be said out loud to be enforced. The hierarchy lived in the way bodies arranged themselves without thinking, in who moved aside first, in who spoke without being asked, in who waited for permission that never came as word, only as a glance, a nod, a silence that yes. It was wartime, but the war felt less like explosions and more like a constant narrowing. The days tightened around you, Choices became fewer, language became careful, even ordinary routines carried a weight, like they'd been handled too many times by anxious hands. Morning started before the sun had fully decided to show itself. The air was always cold in a way that men woke with the same motions, the same tired efficiency, dressing and assembling as if they were not individuals, but parts being fitted into a machine that had been running too long to be stopped politely. There were orders, of course. There were always orders. But what shaped you most were the things that weren't called orders. The unspoken understanding of what could and couldn't be questioned. The invisible walls around certain conversations. The way a sentence could die in your throat because you'd seen that happen to someone else, and you didn't want to become a lesson. Inside the buildings, the air smelled of paper, oil, sweat, metal, and smoke that never fully left anything. Lights were kept low for reasons that had become tradition as much as necessity. A haze lived in corners, clinging to beams and rafters, softening everything into half-clarity. Men leaned over tables, over reports, over messages delivered by exhausted hands. Lines were drawn and redrawn, names were written and crossed out, times were listed, revised, corrected again. There were always voices, but the loudest ones weren't the ones that mattered most. The loudest voices belonged to men who filled space because they feared silence. The voices that mattered were quieter. They didn't need volume, they had gravity. When those men spoke, the room adjusted itself around them, and I was close enough to hear, not close enough to decide. Not close enough to stop anything, but close enough to recognize patterns. Close enough to see when confidence was covering uncertainty. Close enough to hear the strain under certainty. A plan was being held together by willpower and pride instead of truth. My work, my place, kept me near the flow of information, near the constant movement of paper and words, near the pieces that were supposed to create a clear picture, though the picture was... It was always incomplete, always missing something that was lost in transmission or distortion or fear. Messages came in fragments. Reports arrived late. Details contradicted each other. And still, decisions had to be made. That was the cruel logic of it. The machine demanded motion even when sight was poor. The wheel turned whether the road was there or not. Men around me acted as if certainty could be manufactured by repetition. If you said something enough times, if you said it confidently, if you said it in the right tone, it began to sound like fact. Doubt became impolite. Hesitation became suspicious. You learned quickly what suspicion could do. Not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it was quiet, a name no longer included in a conversation, a hand that stopped reaching for when papers were being passed around, a door that used to be open now left shut, a superior who stopped looking at you directly, as if even eye contact was a liability. Sometimes it was worse than that. Not loud punishment, not theater, just disappearance from usefulness. A man reduced to silence by being made irrelevant. In wartime, irrelevance could be fatal, even if your body stayed where it was. So men protected themselves. They protected their positions, their faces, their reputations. They protected the illusion that they understood what was happening. Because if you admitted you didn't, you weren't just confessing weakness. You were offering yourself up as something that could be replaced. The chain of command was a living thing. It breathed through corridors and rooms. It fed on urgency. It hated friction. It wanted agreement, not truth. Agreement moved faster. If you were below, you learned to anticipate what was wanted. You learned to shape your answers, your posture, even your silence, into something that would not invite attention. You learned to speak in ways that sounded helpful without sounding challenging. There was a particular kind of fear that lived in places like that, and it was not the fear of death. It was the fear of becoming the problem. No one wanted to be the person who slowed the machine down. No one wanted to be the one who introduced a complication when everyone else was trying to simplify. Especially not when simplification felt like survival. In the hours between tasks, there were small human things. Coffee gone cold, cigarettes shared without looking at each other, sleeves rolled up and rolled down again, jokes that landed with a flatness because no one was fully present enough to laugh. At times, the world outside felt distant, like it belonged to another kind of life. The war made its own weather. Even when it didn't rain, everything felt damp with fatigue, and through all of it, I carried what I'd noticed. Not one single revelation, not one dramatic certainty, just a growing shape of unease that formed as the days repeated themselves. A detail here that didn't match a detail there, a calculation that assumed something it shouldn't, a confidence that sounded too practiced, too eager. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone of anything. It wasn't even enough to be sure, but it was enough to feel the warning building in me, stronger now because the world around me kept pretending it didn't exist. I would stand with papers in my hands and listen to men higher than me speak, as if their words were weightless, as if language couldn't kill. I would watch them decide what would happen next in voices that stayed calm, because calm itself was a kind of authority. And every time my mind reached for the warning, it ran into the same invisible fence, the knowledge that my voice would not be heard as help. It would be heard as interruption, as doubt, as disobedience. So I learned to do what most men did in that place. I learned to keep my face composed. I learned to keep my eyes down at the right moments. I learned to wait until the room had decided what truth would be. And I learned, without anyone teaching me directly, that speaking up was not simply a matter of courage. It was a matter of permission. And permission was never given to people like me. The arguments began quietly, so quietly that at first I didn't recognize them as arguments at all. They sounded like reason. They sounded like caution, like maturity, like the voice of someone who understood how fragile things were and didn't want to break them by reaching too fast. Every time the warning rose in me, another thought rose with it, already prepared, already shaped to push it back down. You don't know enough yet. You're seeing fragments, not the whole. Men above you have more information than you do. If it were truly dangerous, someone else would have noticed. That last one was the most comforting, and the most dishonest. I replayed conversations in my head long after they ended. The pauses between sentences mattered more to me than the words themselves. A hesitation that lasted half a second too long. A phrase repeated as if repetition could solidify it. A confident answer that arrived too quickly, before the question had finished settling. I told myself I was imagining patterns because I was tired. Everyone was tired. Fatigue was everywhere. On faces, in voices, in the way tempers flared and then vanished just as fast, as if no one had the energy to tame anger. It would have been easy to blame the unease on that. Easier still to call it nerves. But nerves don't align facts against each other. Nerves don't whisper the same concern again and again in different. I would stand there, listening, my attention divided between being said and what was. And in those moments, my body reacted before my thoughts did. My shoulders tightened, my breathing slowed, my fingers pressed too hard into the edge of a table, into the crease of paper, into my own palm. There were times, dangerous times, when someone would say something that brushed directly against the warning without touching it, a sentence that leaned close enough to make my heart jump. My mind would race ahead, imagining how easily I could complete the thought how natural it would sound if I spoke it aloud, as if it had always been part of the conversation. Those were the moments when my silence felt most deliberate, because it wasn't ignorance holding me back. It wasn't confusion. It was calculation. I measured consequences the way others measured distance or time. If I spoke now, who would hear it? Who would repeat it? Whose authority would it brush against? Whose certainty would it threaten? I pictured faces tightening, not in anger, but in something colder. Evaluation. I imagined the shift afterward, the subtle one, the one that doesn't announce itself, where my presence would begin to feel inconvenient, where my words, even when harmless, would be received with that slight delay that tells you you've been reclassified, not trusted, not dangerous enough to remove, just watched. I had seen that category before. I told myself I could wait for a better moment, a private moment, a quieter moment, a moment when the warning wouldn't feel like contradiction but contribution. I convinced myself that timing mattered more than truth, and that saying the right thing at the wrong time could be worse than saying nothing at all. Sometimes, I even practiced the warning in my head. I stripped it of emotion, sanded down the edges, removed anything that might sound like accusation. I rehearsed versions that sounded technical, neutral, helpful, versions that asked questions instead of making statements, versions that left room for others to arrive at the conclusion themselves, so I wouldn't have to be the one who placed it there. But every version ended the same way, with me still silent, because no matter how carefully I shaped the words, I couldn't shape the fact of who I was, and I couldn't disguise the imbalance. The truth would still be coming from below, moving upward against gravity, and gravity always. There was also fear that had nothing to do with hierarchy, fear of being wrong. That one gnawed at me in the quiet hours. What if the unease was mine alone? What if I spoke and exposed nothing but my own misunderstanding? What if the warning, once spoken, collapsed under scrutiny and left me standing there with nothing but doubt in my hands? In wartime, mistakes don't fade quickly. They attach themselves to names. They follow you into rooms long after the original moment has passed. A single misjudgment can become a story others tell about you, and stories have a longer reach than facts. So, I ask myself the safest question over and over again. Is it worth it? Worth the risk? Worth the attention? Worth the possibility of being remembered not for what happened, but for what I dared to suggest before it did? The answer kept changing, depending on the hour, the tone of the room, the look on a superior's face. Some days, it felt unbearable not to speak. The silence weighed so heavily that it followed me even when I left the building, even when I lay down and closed my eyes. Other days, the machine ran smoothly enough to lull me into doubt again. Everything moved, Orders were given. Tasks were completed. The world did not immediately collapse. And in that movement, I found excuses to breathe easier. See? I told myself. If it were truly wrong, it would already be falling apart. That was the lie I leaned on most. Because it allowed me to feel responsible without acting. It allowed me to believe that awareness itself was a form of contribution. That by seeing the danger, by carrying it quietly, I was somehow balancing it, containing it, preventing it from becoming real, simply by acknowledging it internally. But awareness without action doesn't contain anything. It just waits. And the longer I waited, the heavier the silence became, not as absence, but as presence, a thing with mass. A thing that pressed inward, shaping my thoughts, narrowing my options. By then, the warning was no longer a sudden realization. It was a constant companion, and every time I chose not to speak, it learned something about me. It learned that I could be persuaded. It learned that I could be patient. It learned that, given enough fear and enough uncertainty, I would stay exactly where I was, silent, still, waiting for a moment that was already passing. The moment didn't arrive the way I had imagined it would. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sudden hush, no sense of the room bracing itself. It came dressed as routine, wrapped in familiarity, carried forward by voices that sounded calm because they had practiced sounding that way for years. We were gathered as we often, bodies angled toward the same focal point, attention already aligned before anyone spoke. Papers were, chairs scraped softly and then settled. Someone cleared his throat, not because he needed to, but because that was how things began. I felt it before it happened, the warning tightening inside me, drawing itself into a single, precise shape. It was clearer now than it had ever been. The last fragments had fallen into place quietly, without ceremony. There was no longer anything vague about it, no longer a feeling that could be blamed on fatigue or imagination. This was it. The thought didn't come with panic. It came with a strange, almost calm certainty. The kind that doesn't rush you, because it doesn't need to. The kind that says, if you speak now, it will matter. The words formed fully for the first time. They weren't dramatic. They weren't emotional. They didn't accuse or plead. They simply pointed to the flaw, the assumption everyone was stepping over, the risk being treated as negligible because acknowledging it would slow things down. I knew exactly how I would say it, not loudly, not with urgency that could be dismissed as nerves, just enough to interrupt the flow, just enough to force a pause. And that pause, that was what frightened me most. Because I could feel how fragile the momentum was, how much effort had gone into maintaining it. The decision wasn't being forced by chaos. It was being guided gently forward by confidence, by the shared relief of having arrived at something that looked like clarity. To stop that, even briefly, would be to expose how thin it really was. Someone began to speak, someone whose voice the room leaned toward automatically. The tone was measured, reassuring, final. The kind of voice that didn't invite additions, only acceptance. As he spoke, I watched heads nod. Not enthusiastically, not even consciously, just small movements of agreement, as if the body itself had decided before the mind could object. I felt my chest tighten. This was the last opening, not a dramatic one, just a narrow space between sentences, between breaths. A moment so ordinary it would vanish if no one touched it. My body reacted first. I leaned forward slightly, my lips parted. Air moved in, preparing to shape sound, and then something else moved faster. Fear, yes, but not the simple kind, not the fear of punishment or reprimand. It was the fear of rupture, the fear of being the one who breaks the surface and reveals what everyone else is carefully floating over. I became acutely aware of myself, of how small my presence was, of how easily I could be isolated by a single raised eyebrow. A brief silence after my words. I imagined the warning leaving my mouth and landing badly, not because it was wrong, but because it came from me. I imagined the polite acknowledgement would follow, the nod that said we hear you, without meaning we accept it, the way the conversation would continue regardless, leaving my words suspended behind us, awkward and unresolved, and worse than that, I imagined them stopping. Imagined the room turning just enough to acknowledge the disruption. Imagined questions asked not to understand, but to contain. Imagined the subtle shift from discussion to assessment, from planning to damage control. I imagined myself becoming the problem that needed to be managed. The man speaking reached the end of his sentence. There it was. The silence opened, not wide, not dramatic, just enough. Time did something strange in that space. It stretched without slowing. Every detail sharpened. The grain of the table beneath my finger, the faint hum in the walls, the weight of my own breathing, suddenly too loud. I could feel my heart beating against my ribs. Not fast, but heavy, as if each beat had to push through resistance. This was the point of no return. I knew that if I spoke now, I would not be able to take it back. The words would exist independently of me, be heard, interpreted, remembered, or misremembered. They would enter a system that did not care about my intentions, only about the effect. And if I didn't speak, the choice clarified itself with brutal simplicity. Speaking would cost me something immediately. Silence would cost me something later. The later cost felt abstract, distant, uncertain. The immediate cost was concrete. It had faces. It had consequences I could imagine clearly. I thought of how easily people here closed ranks around authority, how quickly deviation was framed as disruption, how the machinery of justification could turn even reasonable concern into an inconvenience. I thought of my place, how precarious it actually was, how much of it depended on being predictable, agreeable, reliable in my quietness. I told myself one final lie. Someone else will say it. The room held its breath, waiting for continuation, not interrupt, and I gave it what it expected. I let the silence pass through me without resistance. I closed my mouth, leaned back. The moment sealed itself. Someone else spoke, picking up exactly where the previous voice had left off, as if no space had existed at all. The conversation flowed on, smooth and uninterrupted, relieved of the threat it never knew it faced. The decision moved forward, and I sat there, feeling the physical weight of what I had just done. Not relief, not peace, something heavier, something final. Because in that moment, I understood that silence is not the absence of action. It is an action taken inward, and once taken, it cannot be undone. I had not merely failed to speak. I had chosen not to. The first signs came quietly, the way I had feared they would. Not as alarms, not as sudden chaos. Just small confirmations, arriving one by one, each too modest to justify panic, yet too precise to ignore. A report that arrived later than expected, a detail revised without explanation, a correction delivered casually, as if it had always been part of the plan. I recognized them immediately. That was the worst part. I saw the shape of the outcome forming before anyone named it. The same way you recognize a face in a crowd before you understand why it feels familiar. The same way you sense an illness before the fever arrives. Nothing had collapsed yet, but the structure was no longer sound. The room didn't change much at first. The routines held. Voices stayed calm. Authority remained intact. If anything, the certainty grew louder, as if volume could reinforce what was already slipping. I told myself this was normal. Adjustments always happened. Wartime was a constant exercise in correction. Plans bent. Timelines shifted. That didn't mean the warning had been right, but the confirmations kept coming. Each one landed with a dull weight inside me. Not shock, recognition. A tightening in the chest that said, this is it. This is the thing you tried not to imagine too clearly. I would stand where I had always stood, listening to discussions that now carried a faint edge of strain beneath their surface. Words like delay and complication began to appear more often, though no one lingered on them. Explanations grew longer. Sentences circled themselves before landing. I noticed how often people avoided each other's eyes. That was new. When confidence erodes, it doesn't vanish all at once. It fractures. Men begin to protect themselves from implication. Statements are phrased carefully. Responsibility is blurred, spread thin enough that no one has to hold it fully. And still, no one named the core problem. No one said the thing I had almost said. I felt it everywhere, this unspoken presence moving through conversations like a shadow. It lived in the pauses after questions, in the way certain topics were redirected quickly, as if touching them too directly might tear something up. I stopped sleeping. At night, my mind replayed the moment of silence again and again, but not as it had been. It changed. In some versions, I spoke. In others, someone else did. In all of them, the room reacted differently, sometimes listening, sometimes resisting, sometimes collapsing into argument. I woke with my jaw clenched, my throat sore, as if I had been speaking all night without sound. The consequences did not arrive with drama. They arrived with accumulation. A problem that should have been contained spread further than expected. A calculation proved optimistic. A timeline no longer aligned with reality. Each development was explained away in isolation, but together they formed a pattern too familiar to dismiss. I watched men work harder without working wiser. Hours stretched, tempers shortened, cigarettes burned down faster. There was more silence now, but it wasn't the careful silence of discipline. It was the brittle silence of avoidance. At some point, the first real acknowledgement appeared, not spoken as failure, but as surprise, as if events had betrayed expectations rather than fulfilled warnings. I remember the exact moment it happened, not because it was loud, because someone stopped mid-sentence, just a brief hesitation, barely noticeable. But in that hesitation, something shifted. The tone changed. The confidence cracked, not fully, but enough to let something darker seep through. Concern. After that, everything felt heavier. Conversations carried an edge of urgency they hadn't before. Decisions were still made, but with less certainty and more defensiveness. The machine continued to move, but now it groaned as it did. I stood there, absorbing it all, my silence now an anchor dragging behind me, because by then, the warning no longer mattered. Not in the way it once could have. It had missed its moment. The system had adapted around the flaw instead of addressing it. Just enough adjustments to keep going. Just enough denial to avoid stopping and looking directly at what had gone wrong. And I understood something that settled deep and cold inside me. Even if I spoke now, it would change nothing. The cost of silence had already been paid. Not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. I felt no relief in being right, only a growing sense of uselessness. Because the knowledge I carried, once urgent, once sharp, had become dull with inevitability. It was no longer a warning, it was an observation. And observations, when they arrive too late, do not save anyone. They only confirm what has already been lost. I watched the consequences unfold not as catastrophe, but as erosion, as trust thin, as certainty draining away, as people quietly realizing that something had been wrong long before it became visible. And through it all, my silence intact, not unnoticed, just unchallenged, which in a way felt worse, because it meant the world had continued on without needing my voice at all, and I had helped make that possible. I am far from. Time has put distance between me and the walls, the voices, the decisions that once felt unavoidable. The war moved on. It found new places to inhabit, new men to exhaust, new moments to hollow out. History folded itself forward, carrying the visible consequences while leaving quieter ones. Mine stayed with. Memory is not faithful. It doesn't preserve events as they were. It reshapes them according to what you cannot escape. And the moment I cannot escape is not what happened afterward. It is the moment just before, when the words were complete, ready, and still mine to give or withhold. That moment never fades. It returns without warning, in still rooms, in ordinary conversations, in pauses that last a second too long. I feel it in my throat first, always, a tightening, a pressure, as if my body remembers something my mind has learned to avoid. I no longer replay the aftermath. That part has settled into the past where it belongs. What stays alive is the silence itself, the exact shape of it, the way it felt when I chose it. I remember how reasonable it seemed, how calm, how justified. Silence didn't announce itself as cowardice. It arrived disguised as discipline, as patience, as respect for structure. It felt responsible, mature, necessary. That is what makes it so difficult to confront now. There was no single moment where I could say, this is where I failed. Only a moment where I complied. And compliance leaves no visible wound. People have asked me, in different ways, whether I regret anything. They never mean it precisely. They mean outcome, results. Whether things might have gone differently if circumstances had shifted. I answer carefully, truthfully, but not completely. Because how do you explain regret that has no action attached to it? How do you describe guilt that comes not from what you did, but from what you protected yourself from doing? There is no confession that fits that shape. The silence did not end when the moment passed. It stayed active. It followed me into every recollection, every retelling that left something unsaid. It trained me to hesitate even when no one was watching, to measure words long after the danger of speaking had disappeared. I learned something then that has never stopped being true. Silence is not temporary. Once you choose it at the cost of truth, it becomes easier to choose again. It carves a path. It teaches you where not to step. Over time, it begins to feel like part of your character instead of a decision you once made under pressure. That is the part that frightens. Not the memory of fear, but the memory of how adaptable I was to it. Sometimes I imagine the words as they would have existed outside of me. Not powerful, not transformative, just present, spoken, real. I imagine them entering the room and changing nothing at all, the decision continuing anyway, the outcome remaining the same. Even in that version, something would be different. The silence would not belong to me. That is what I carry now. The knowledge that the cost of speaking was never the point. The cost of silence was. It didn't destroy my life. It didn't mark me publicly. No one points to me when they tell the story. My name does not appear in records or accusation. I remained intact. But intact is not the same as untouched. The words I never let out did not disappear. They stayed inside me, heavy and unfinished. And over time they changed the way I listen, the way I pause, the way I live with own thoughts. I do not seek forgiveness. I do not offer explanation. I only live with the understanding that there was a moment when responsibility asked something small of me. Only a sentence, only a breath. And I answered with quiet. And that quiet, once chosen, never truly ends. It just waits.